Hey y'all, welcome back. And I'm sure it's obvious by now that the environment from which I'm coming to you is a little bit different than usual. When I was fortunate enough to be offered this position, I had already scheduled a family beach trip. And so it has worked out that I have needed to record some of these lectures from the beach. I will turn around so you can see we are about a block away from Ocean Isle Beach in southern North Carolina, just north of Myrtle Beach. We have 3 generations here at this house. My parents, my in-laws, my brother-in-law, who you may be able to hear playing some sweet licks of jazz on the deck above me. I think that's really amazingly perfect for what we're going to be talking about this week. We also have my children here, so heads up in case we get interrupted at any point. That shouldn't happen, at least not anything beyond what's brief. You may have also noticed that I'm dressed a little bit differently than usual because in sort of a absent-minded way that is somewhat typical of my personality sometimes, I neglected to bring collared shirts in my suitcase. So what I have done, as I like to do with most sort of emerging challenges in my life, I've taken the opportunity to reveal a little bit more about my personality to you. So there will be at least 3 video lectures in this module, and in each of them I'm going to wear a t-shirt that reveals a little bit more about who I am for you. So the first one is perhaps my favorite that I brought with me. Well, maybe not my favorite, but it's close. It's in the top 2 or 3, and it reveals my thing, I guess, for quirky minor league baseball teams. Okay, this logo here is of the Rocket City Trash Pandas. Of course, I love that they're called the Trash Pandas. Comes from a meme that you probably all have seen with different names for dangerous wildlife. I think the brown bear was called the danger floof. Poisonous snakes are danger noodles. There's one that's called the something about a nope, which I think is hilarious. And of course, raccoons are called trash pandas. This team hails from northern Alabama, and some of y'all may be familiar that in Huntsville, Alabama, which is the northern part of the state, there is the NASA Rocket Center. They are the Rocket City Trash Pandas, and this trash can is intended to look like a rocket. As you can see here at the bottom here, 2020 Just Trash. For those of you who follow baseball, Major League or minor league or both, you might know that the pandemic canceled the 2020 minor league baseball season. It just so happened that 2020 was supposed to be Rocket City's first, like their inaugural season. Okay, so they didn't sell any tickets, so they sold t-shirts and hats. I have one of those as well, that indicated who they were and kind of poked fun at the fact that their season was trashed in clever ways. I bought this shirt. I hope you enjoy it. I enjoy it very much. It's very soft, comfortable, so great for wearing at the beach. Also, perhaps great for setting the tone for Module 4. So welcome to Module 4. we will be covering a series of anxiety-related disorders this week. So we will be covering, in addition to the class of anxiety disorders, we'll be also taking on the somatic symptom disorders and the feeding and eating disorders. We're going to skip over, for now, as you'll notice, anxiety disorders comes right after the depressive disorders, which we covered in module 3. And then we are going to skip over obsessive compulsive related disorders, as well as trauma and stress related and dissociative disorders, and then take on somatic symptom disorders and feeding and eating disorders. We're going to do this because of the different level of severity of the symptoms and prognosis of obsessive compulsive and trauma and stress related disorders, as well as dissociative disorders. Just of course, dissociative was covered in module 2. With psychotic disorders, OCD and trauma will be covered in module 5. So next week. So the common theme of anxiety, somatic, and eating disorder classes is more or less sort of a low grade, relatively low grade, chronic fear state that manifests with symptoms that appear to avoid as trying to avoid adverse experiences, create concrete explanations for distress and the absence thereof, and or control the environment in ultimately self-defeating ways. And of course, these symptoms across these 3 classes can have and do have profound effects on the mind and body. Today, we're primarily covering anxiety disorders. So this class, of course, appears right after the depressive disorders. They are often closely associated. The depressive disorders are often closely associated with anxiety disorders. Some argue that anxiety disorders should come first in the sort of developmental organization of the DSM-5-TR, because depression is arguably the result of chronically unresolved anxiety and or panic. Dr. Jack Panksepp gets into this a little bit in the video that I posted in the psychopharmacology folder for this module. So included in the anxiety disorders class in developmental order are separation anxiety disorder, specific phobia, social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, as well as sort of definitions of what a panic attack is. Agoraphobia, selective mutism, I think selective mutism actually comes before social anxiety. And then, of course, generalized anxiety disorder, along with substance-induced due to medical condition and other specified and unspecified anxiety disorders. Going through each of these briefly, just to point out a couple of key nuances that you're going to want to really pay attention to. So separation anxiety disorder is characterized by sort of developmentally inappropriate distress upon separation from attachment figures. So you're really going to need to apply your knowledge of human development for this diagnosis. This kind of thing shows up oftentimes when a child is changing environments. Sometimes it's developmentally appropriate. So perhaps a preschooler or a kindergartner clinging to a parent's leg on the first day of classes probably within developmentally expected range of behavior, right? However, if you were to experience this with a 3rd grader, it may be time to look deeper, because in general terms, a 3rd grader has had opportunities to have this sort of separation experience, tolerate it, and incorporate their mental state into the activity. So all that to say, keep in mind that human development and knowing what's developmentally appropriate is really important for, especially important for diagnosing separation anxiety disorder. Selective mutism is a consistent and persistent failure to speak when expected. This failure to speak usually lasts longer than 1 month. It's often associated with trauma. but not necessarily. It must be differentiated from other plausible explanations. For example, perhaps the selective mutism is, or just the mutism itself is the result of a neurodevelopmental disorder or an adjustment to culture, language in the case of maybe moving. This is particularly important when it comes to working with refugee populations, immigrant populations. Next up is specific phobia. This is where you're going to find, or where you would diagnose arachnophobia, acrophobia, claustrophobia, etc. It's very important in this diagnosis to pay very close attention to specifiers and coding procedures, because they may be different depending upon the prevailing phobia. Next up is social anxiety. This is closely related to sort of a performance-based anxiety, or being observed, or other social interactions where people may develop sort of cognitive distortions. That's sort of a fancy way of saying they misread or misinterpret sort of threat in the social environment. Following social anxiety is panic disorder. So similar, this is sort of similar to the episodic mood disorders that specifically define, in that specifically defined panic attacks must be present, and also include persistent worry about the attacks between attacks. Perhaps a person changes their behavior in maladaptive ways or self-defeating ways to avoid the attacks. And panic attacks, it's really important to pay attention to this, because in our common discourse, the term panic attack or anxiety attack oftentimes is used interchangeably. But for us as clinicians, the term panic attack has a very specific definition. It is defined by including 4 or more of the defined symptoms. And it is definitely more than just people thinking that they're having a heart attack without medical evidence. Okay, there's more to it than sort of the heart palpitations that you've heard a lot about in our common discourse. So pay very close attention to the specific defining criteria of a panic attack. A panic attack, at least one panic attack, is necessary for a panic disorder, but panic attacks can exist independent of panic disorder, and a panic attack is not a diagnosis in and of itself. Very important to remember those things. Next up is agoraphobia, which can often be confused with specific phobia and or social anxiety disorder. We'll get into that a little bit later on. So agoraphobia is associated primarily with the fear of leaving home, but it is not necessarily the case. So it's actually more about being in an environment where a person feels as though escape or accessing assistance to solve some type of problem is either impossible or very difficult, okay? And so even if a person is afraid of leaving the home, to meet diagnostic criteria for agoraphobia, they must also be afraid of one or more of the following sort of situations. So they must be afraid of public or using public transport, must be afraid of open spaces, must be afraid of enclosed spaces such as shops or theaters, etc. And they could also be afraid of standing in line or being in a crowd. Again, there are essentially 5 different sort of fear situations associated with agoraphobia, and a person to meet diagnostic criteria must have 2 of these sort of fear situations, and the fear must be closely associated with sort of a assessment that escape or accessing assistance is impossible or very difficult. Okay. Rounding out the very specific diagnoses in this class is generalized anxiety disorder. This is characterized by chronic worry that persists longer than 6 months, that the client finds difficult to control, and is manifested by 3 of 6 specific symptoms. Now, this persisting longer than 6 months is really important because this duration specifier or duration criterion separates this disorder from an adjustment disorder, which we will get into next week when we talk about stressor and trauma related disorders. That 6-month duration is really important to remember in terms of generalized anxiety disorder. The 6 symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder are sort of a restlessness or edginess, feeling keyed up. A person may also report feeling easily fatigued. They may have difficulty concentrating or having their mind go blank. They may be dealing with irritability, muscle tension, and or a sleep disturbance. Again, a person who is meeting criteria for generalized anxiety disorder must have chronic worry that they find difficult to control, persisting longer than 6 months, and manifested by 3 of the 6 symptoms I just read: restlessness, easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating or mind going blank, irritability, muscle tension, and or sleep disturbance. And again, like I said before, duration differentiates this from an adjustment disorder with anxious distress. And then, of course, the class concludes with anxiety disorders due to substance misuse, due to a medical condition, other specified or unspecified anxiety disorder. And of course, just like in the other classes, the definitions of these disorders are mapped out for you at the back of the class. So it's a lot to cover there. Let's take a minute to spend some time with a case example that I think is really interesting because it points out a couple of ways that anxiety disorders can conflate or seemingly conflate with each other. And I'll discuss with you or talk to you about how I arrived at the diagnosis that I did and how that differentiates from another disorder in the class. So I'm going to share my screen with you. All right. Well, that's not where I wanted us to be. Try one more time. And not quite where I want us. So we're going to work on this another way. There we go. All right. So I want to introduce you to Joseph. So Joseph is described in a case example underneath this video, like usual. If you have not yet read Joseph's vignette, please do so now. We'll pause for a second for you to come back. Pause. Okay, for those of you who have now read Joseph's vignette, I welcome you back. Joseph identifies, as you read, as a 65-year-old Native American of Cherokee descent who is married, cisgender, cisgender man who lives with his partner of 46 years, Nancy. Joseph and Nancy raised 2 daughters who are now adults and live in different parts of the United States. Joseph retired a year ago from his position of professor of anthropology. And during this time in academia, he was confident, motivated, and dedicated to his work. Of course, I think I failed to mention in this introduction that he was in this position for 30 years. So quite a long career in academia. He was considered a hardworking, punctual person who rarely missed work. Throughout his career and until retirement, he wrote and made presentations across the United States. Joseph has a strong cultural identity and remains extremely close with his children. He regularly speaks with them both. Joseph reported that he has been looking forward to slowing down a bit during his retirement and doing all the things he did not have time for with Nancy. Despite these assets, Joseph reported feeling anxious about his quote open schedule and about about going and quote meeting new people in the community. This has affected his enjoyment of travel and led to his avoidance of leaving his home. Declining capabilities with vision and hearing have reportedly exacerbated his disinterest in social opportunities. Joseph has presented for counseling at Nancy's recommendation. Joseph reported the following information unless otherwise noted. So as far as his socioeconomic status, he's a 65-year-old retiree from a long-held academic position in higher education. No concerns about finances or social status were reported, other than Joseph's concerns that others are evaluating and or judging him. I'm going to highlight a couple of those items about judging and evaluating and presenting problems, and I'll explain to you why in just a moment. So I identified essentially two primary presenting problems here for Joseph. First of all, being social anxiety. He feels anxious about his open schedule and about going and quote meeting new people in the community. The new feelings of anxiety started to gradually escalate in the first few months after he retired. Joseph feels his anxiety or this anxiety when he is around other people. As a professor, when he was often anxious to be in front of the class, but he focused on teaching the material, and this enabled him to deal with his anxiety. Currently, without this type of distraction, his focus is more upon himself. And due to recent decline in his vision and hearing, Joseph reports persistent and pervasive thoughts that others are judging and evaluating him as being disabled. You may hear sort of the difference between social anxiety and perhaps a type of agoraphobia in this first presenting problem. And you will certainly hear it, I think, in the second presenting problem. So this is a reluctance to engage in activities that involve social interaction. Joseph feels trapped because he doesn't want to leave his home or be around others, yet his wife wants them to engage in more extracurricular leisure activities such as attending concerts, painting, and sculpture classes, and catching up with family and old friends across the country. A week after his retirement, Joseph and his wife made a trip to Yellowstone National Park, and he felt relief when they arrived at the park and were secluded away from other people. He says that he only feels safe in his home, and that even when he is in his yard, in a crowd, or in line at the grocery store, he feels overwhelmed by this intense anxiety that he is being judged or evaluated by others. Relevant history, as reported above, his concerns may have been present prior to retirement. However, protective factors were removed when he retired, and his social distress began to worsen about 11 months ago, that is 1 month after retirement, during a trip to Yellowstone National Park. Joseph is an intelligent, insightful, and thoughtful individual. He is a reliable, devoted, driven, and hardworking person. He possesses multiple educational degrees and has been gainfully employed for over 30 years in higher education. He is passionate about his culture, his family, and desires to enjoy his retirement. He enjoys a close relationship with his wife of 46 years. She is a loving, dedicated, and invested in his well-being. And additionally, he is extremely close with his daughters and speaks with them regularly. Joseph has a strong cultural identity and feels connected to his family, his community, and his ancestors. He has long-standing relationships with colleagues, yet secondary to his current isolating behaviors. He has not connected with these individuals recently. Medically, Joseph has been experiencing declines with vision and hearing that appear typical of his developmental situation or level. No concerns were reported regarding suicide or self-harm risk. No medications, legal concerns, substance misuse, or historical family health concerns were reported. So I landed at social anxiety disorder. And to this clinician, Joseph's anxiety about multiple social situations across multiple environments appears to be closely related to fears about scrutiny by others and include meeting unfamiliar people and being observed, which meets criteria in A. Joseph noting his a decline in vision and hearing, reported fears of being negatively evaluated by others, which meets criterion B. Social situations appear almost always to provoke these anxious feelings, criterion C. Situations are avoided generally or endured, see relief in isolated settings at Yellowstone, which meets criterion D. And there does not appear to be an actual threat presented to Joseph, criterion E. Symptoms have been present for 11 months, which meets the 6 months criteria in criterion F. And they have impaired his functioning as it relates to his wishes for retirement and his time spent with Nancy, other family, and friends and colleagues, which meets criterion G. Agoraphobia was considered given Joseph's concerns about leaving home alone and being in crowds in line at the grocery store. However, agoraphobia was ruled out because Joseph's symptoms are reportedly more related to worries about negative evaluation of others rather than fears of that escape or accessing assistance may be difficult. I also, if you were to be doing a case example in your vignettes like this, I would not require this of you because we have not covered stressor and trauma related disorders, but I also might rule out an adjustment disorder, and we can rule that out because the duration has exceeded 6 months in this case. So again, you're not required to differentiate necessarily from disorders we have not yet covered. Also, but also just keep in mind that there is a guide under each diagnostic condition that indicates sort of common / primary differentiators in a differential diagnosis section. You're probably already familiar with that. Make sure that that continues. In terms of neurological and biological considerations, including psychopharmacology, like most anxiety disorders, social anxiety has been associated with mis or overinterpretation of threat to an individual and their environment, and fight, flight, or freeze mechanisms that are controlled by the hippocampus being connected to not the hippocampus, but the hippocampus is involved, the limbic system, so amygdala, hippocampus, thalamus, connected with sort of autonomic sort of mechanisms in the hindbrain or cerebrum, without sort of close connection with the prefrontal cortex. These are overactive neurologically. So SSRIs or SNRIs and benzodiazepines have demonstrated effectiveness in the treatment of social anxiety disorder. Paxil, Zoloft, Luvox, and Effexor are usually the first medications utilized and are approved by the FDA for the treatment of social anxiety disorder. Benzodiazepines like Klonopin and Xanax are often prescribed to help control incidental provocations of anxiety in social situations. It should be noted, however, that benzodiazepines have addictive properties and have been associated with rates of comorbid alcohol abuse. Joseph may be a good candidate for benzodiazepines given the absence of substance abuse history. However, he may prefer to go with a course of SSRI or SNRI medications to avoid developing dependence upon addictive substances. So hopefully that gives you sort of a window into how a clinician might approach the assessment and diagnosis of Joseph's presenting concerns. I look forward to how y'all handle our vignette this week. And I look forward to picking this up again from this second level of the beach house in Ocean Isle as we open up somatic disorders later in the module. Until then, have a good day. See you soon.